Handmade pottery has been part of the rural economy for at least 6,000 years in Cyprus. In more recent times, pottery making in Cyprus, an island in the eastern Mediterranean, can be traced to Kornos village, 30 minutes south of the capital, Lefkosia. Giovanni Mariti, an Italian priest who came to Cyprus to study wine production and storage in 1769, wrote about potters at Kornos, near Lefkara, where in 1878 John Thompson photographed women with their pots at the well. In the late 1920s, Kornos potters posed for archaeologist Joan Duplat-Taylor. In 1898, Émile Deschamps described Fini village, high in the Troodos Mountains, and well known for the manufacture of pitharia, the huge jars. Mr. Pilavakis is the last in a long line of Fini pitharadis, the itinerant potters who made the jars, like those embedded in the late 19th century Lemissos sidewalk. The traditional potters of today create similar pots and face identical limitations imposed by the native raw materials as their ancient counterparts. For these reasons, the women potters of Cyprus have been the focus of ethno-archaeological research from March to October 1986, with a follow-up study 14 years later to learn what has changed or remained the same. Whereas there's no difference in the clay, coil manufacture, and firing, changes did occur in the number of potters and in the patterns incised on the pots. In 1986, nearly 25 potters were dispersed in 4 villages of southern Cyprus. By 1999, only 10 remain active. No young people are learning the craft, and all potters are over 55 years of age. Formerly, men made pots and were responsible for clay and fuel procurement, tasks they shared with their wives. The final stage of work is to unload the fired pottery from the kiln. Incised, combed, and punctate patterns decorate the wares, which lack paint, slip, and glaze. The work begins with digging the clay from deposits near the villages and piling it close to the work area. Private potters in Kornos and in the mountain communities of Kaminaria, Ios Dimitrios Marathassa, and Fini dig their clay individually, and in 1986, clay and wood fuel for the kilns were transported to the potter's home by car or donkey. In the foothills village of Kornos, where a pottery cooperative was established in the early 1950s, the clay is mechanically excavated. The workspace of the cooperative lies on the village periphery, adjacent to the water source. Members of the cooperative work in a shaded workspace and never in direct sunlight, which would dry the clay too quickly and cause cracking. Their wares dry in a darkroom behind the workspace. Theodora brings clay she has made earlier in the day. To prepare clay, it is exposed to the sun and the largest rocks are manually extracted. The potter then more carefully inspects it and tosses unwanted fragments out the window before the clay goes through an electric pulverizer. The resulting powder is mixed manually with water and sent through an electric pug mill, all in 1 or 2 hours. The finished clay is piled into a pilos and is often used immediately with no time allotted for souring the clay. Private potters work in their homes dispersed throughout the village. Their kilns stand adjacent to houses, much to the dismay of their neighbors. Once a potter retires, the kiln is often dismantled to reuse the bricks, stone, and space. Finished pots dry while potters start work on others. Each potter feels the clay to determine how dry it is throughout the shaping process before adding coils to increase the vessel height or before positioning handles. Kyriakou, a private potter who works in the courtyard of her home, scrapes the sides of her pilos to prevent the outermost clay from drying. She wets the 3 clay dabs on her turntable head before placing a bat of stone, wood, or bark on top. After each stage of the work, every pot is removed from the turntable on its own bat to allow the clay to dry slightly. Kyriakou shapes and centers a cylinder of clay on the turntable and sprinkles clay powder to prevent the very wet clay from sticking. She pats down the cylinder and then makes a hole, thereby creating an open form in a matter of minutes. She rotates the lightweight turntable easily in both directions, either by pressure on the clay or directly on the wooden turntable. Coils rolled in the air are added to increase the height of the jug. All throughout stage 1, the base is left very thick until, during the final stage of manufacture, it will be thinned, rounded, and smoothed. The potter takes a string from her bag and winds it around the lower body to serve as an external support. This is necessary, according to the potters, since the clay is worked in a very wet state. In the Trotus mountain villages, potters use cloth to wrap around the pots. Turntable heads in the 3 mountain villages are all circular, in contrast to the square head in the lowland village of Kornos. Cypriot traditional potters can rotate the turntable with their hand or foot, thus enabling 2 hands to work the clay. The potter uses a split cane tool to create and smooth the upper body before adding more short coils to shape the jug neck. After placing a final coil, the potter shapes and smooths the upper body and rim with a rag saturated with water and clay before shaping a pinched spout. With a trachudi, a rouletting tool carved from an oleander branch and secured in a cane handle, Kyriakou decorates the shoulder prior to handle application. After decoration, the jug is set aside to dry slightly before a pulled handle is added in stage 2. Checkerboard rouletted patterns went out of use when this potter and others of her generation ceased to make pottery. She stopped in 1996 due to rheumatism. In 1999, Kornos potters use combed patterns, which are interrupted and smudged during handle placement. In the mountain communities, however, the order of the work is reversed. Only after handle application is the incised, stippled pattern carefully placed in relation to the handles. These and other differences allow one to differentiate between wares made in 2 contemporaneous yet distant communities and to identify a mountain versus a lowland ceramic style. To help secure the handle attachment, Kyriakou adds a fillet of clay to the lower contact point, much like that found on ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern jugs and jars. After another drying period, she expands the lower body by pushing the flat base out from the inside, after which the string will be removed. Lastly, vessels of all types are inverted and scraped with an iron strip. Excess clay is scraped away after the string is removed for the last time, and all traces of it vanish. Bases become rounded during this third stage of the work, which requires great skill and experience to avoid mishaps and to create a base of overall even thickness. All clay scraps are reserved for future pots. The potter attaches 2 turntables to create a higher, more comfortable workspace for the finishing touches. Mr. Kyriakou helps his wife with the final surface smoothing and compacting. The surface is still wet, and consequently, no burnish sheen will result. Ceramics made by the private potters dry inside their homes in the living and sleeping areas. Not a member of the Kornos cooperative, Kyriakou has her own kiln and scafi, the trough in which her husband mixes the powdered clay with water contained in the metal basin. He uses a long-handled wooden shovel for this task, as does Elpiniki in Ios Dimitrios, where Andreas, whose wife is the last potter in the village, uses a kopani, a bent tree branch, to pound and crush the clay. During the off-season and prior to the first firing of the year in May 1986, the kiln in Kyriakou's courtyard, like the co-op kiln, is a repository of broken pots and household items. Pots fired in December 1999, belonging to another private potter, remained safe in her kiln until springtime. For juglet manufacture, the potter centers a clay cylinder on the stone bat positioned on her turntable. After expanding it into an open form, with a split cane tool, Kyriakou draws up the clay to create a shoulder and then closes the opening in a smocking technique to form the neck. She rests an arm on her thigh as she uses her fingers with the precision of a pair of scissors to cut away excess clay. In 1986, Kyriakou was one of the 4 Kornos potters making small decorated pieces. By 1999, this tradition remains largely in the hands of 2 sisters, Anna and Maria, who stores her unfired pieces in an unused refrigerator in her workroom.